Good evening. So we're going to continue the Genesis class tonight. It's going into Genesis 14. Before we get started, I want to thank Cody once again for covering for me last week. That weather came in awfully quick, and I appreciate him being prepared to take that over like he was, even that morning. So definitely a big thank you for that. So Genesis 14, here in a minute, we're going to see if I can get somebody to read Genesis, the verses 1 through 11. It's kind of a split. Somebody who likes to read names, because there's a lot of names in that section. Just a little bit of background to get us back grounded where we were, where Cody left off for us last week. Genesis chapter 13, we see the splitting of Abram, and Lot. Abram told Lot, "You pick your side of the property territory. I'll go one, you go that way. I'll go the other way, and that way we stop seeing the fights going between us." So Lot picks the fertile grounds near the city of Sodom. Abram goes and moves into Hebron. So at this point, Abram's in Hebron and Lot is near Sodom. Just to kind of go into what we're about to cover in verses 1 through 11, we're seeing the impact of a war between a group of 4 kings and a group of 5 kings. It looks like, if I'm kind of inferring what's reading here, is you kind of have a city-state nations where each city kind of has its kings, has its army, is kind of a standalone country, so to speak. And so there's the 4 kings that we're going to read of first are in the area of modern-day Iraq, and actually from the area that Abram was originally living in Ur. That's where these kings are coming from. And so they're coming back, kind of following that same trail that Abram did, because if they went straight across, they're crossing the Syrian desert. And then, from reading this, I believe what happened, Chris, Cody, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but the events that we read first off, the original attack, happened prior to the time frame that Abram's currently living in. And what's happening at the time that we're actually going to read this, in the life of Abram, is the rebellion, not the original attack and the 14 years of subjugation that those kings are happening. So we're going to see basically what actually becomes the area of Babylon, attacking what's more or less some of the countries of Israel. The only one I could actually even find on a map of one of the cities for the group of Israel is the city of Zor. We're going to cover that again when we read about the destruction of Sodom. And it's just at the south point of the Dead Sea. The rest of the cities I couldn't even find on a map. We just don't know exactly where they're at. When we get to the destruction of Sodom, we'll definitely cover more about that, we don't know exactly the location of where they're at. So it kind of follows into here that we don't get any real landmarks to where the location is. They're somewhere between like what we know of Jerusalem being and the Dead Sea, from just kind of some of the context that we're going to get into. So if I can, somebody who's pretty comfortable with names, if I can get them to read verses 1 through 11. After that, we'll kind of break the sections up into a little bit smaller groups.
And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Eleazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Beersheba, king of Gomorrah, Shinar, king of Ethma, and Shimbar, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And all these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims, and Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the Zuzims, and Ham, and Emims, and Shavah, and Kirathim, and the Horites, and their mountains here, unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, that dwelt in Hezam Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar. And they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Eleazar. 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there. And they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way.
Appreciate that. That's a lot of hard names in there, so very nicely done. So kind of following how Jerry Moffat's notes are, going to break down some of the verses. In verse 1, we get introduced to the kings that are basically in control of the territory at the time of Abram. They are the kings from that Babylonian environment over by modern-day Iraq. So one of the notes he puts here, and I think Jerry Moffat's mentioning this because there are individuals who think this might be an individual named Hammurabi of the Babylonian Empire. I don't think he technically believes that. He said there are some difficulties with that view. Looking and kind of doing a little bit of research on it, it looks like the dates may not actually fit that it's Hammurabi. Hammurabi, I think, is probably a little bit further down the line than what this time frame is. And I think it's interesting that they bring that up and try to even push that, but there's Hammurabi's code is one of the things that came up on the search, and the only reason it's significant, it's one of the oldest forms of written laws that we have found in history. So I think that's why they're trying to tie all this together. Arioch, according to what he has here, it means sin. I guess he's named after a Babylonian god. Larsa is a Babylonian city in the lower part of the Euphrates. Secular history says it came to throne in 2098, so there's a little bit of evidence there from the secular side that helps support the Bible that there was an individual in that area in power at the time of this battle taking place. Chedorlaomer, which the interesting piece here is he's the one that seems to be leading this. There's actually, from what his notes here say, is there's not enough source material to even speculate the individual existed. And then there's an individual there named Tidal. They have a Babylonian Tudukala, and it's interesting. The King James Version has the King of Nations. I think the ESV and some of the others have a word. I'm going to probably butcher this. It's Goyim, Goiim. It's basically translate to nation, so those words are interchangeable. It kind of looks like he may not have necessarily ruled a city as much as kind of what we kind of think of the barbarian horde, just kind of a little bit more traveling people, probably somebody that controlled people that didn't necessarily have a specific location that they were known to. They were just kind of a nation that may have moved around a little bit. That's just some conjecture, a little bit of, I think, Encyclopedia Britannica, just trying to find out what the importance of that term is and why he gets a king of nations when there's obviously other nations involved with him, even though, so some interesting individuals we get introduced to pretty quick, and actually some history back to Babylon that they can actually locate these individuals in history. In the verse 2 section, we get introduced to the kings that are in what we typically consider in Bible times Israel. So they've actually, from Jerry Moffat's notes once again, they haven't actually been able to tie these individuals back into history, if I'm reading his notes here correctly. If we take the consideration that Sodom, Gomorrah, and some of the surrounding areas were completely and utterly destroyed, and we follow that because it's in the Bible and believe it, it makes sense that we lack that history, because if the history survived, then they probably wouldn't have been completely and utterly destroyed. So there's some logic there that we can't necessarily support those individuals, whereas we can on the Babylonian side. He put some names put the Arabic meanings to some of the individuals here. Bera is victor. Birshah is a sturdy man. Shinab is sin, or moon god is father. So where the other is, Shimbir, the name of God, is mighty, and we don't even get a name for the fifth king. So which is interesting because Zor is the only city that actually survives this fight, even through history. So the three other cities in the plain besides Sodom and Gomorrah are Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, which we actually see here, and only that last one, Bela or Zor, is the only one that's not destroyed when God wipes Sodom and Gomorrah pretty much off the face of the planet. And then we're actually going to come back to Zor when we see that Lot flees, when Sodom's being destroyed. Lot actually asks if he can go to Zor to escape that destruction. So if y'all have any comments, questions, please feel free to interrupt me. There's a lot of history at this point. We're not getting, we'll get into the little bit more biblical aspect when we get into Abram, getting into verses 12 and 13. So the valley of Sikkim that we get introduced to in verse 3 is the southern part of the Dead Sea. It may not have yet been covered with water at this time. It looks like his speculation is that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah kind of flooded the area from the Dead Sea, so it turned that area into a larger bit of water. And that's where they think that Sodom may have been close by to that valley of Siddim. So we read in there where after the 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, which I believe is this part that happened prior to the time that Abram is living here and in Hebron when we left him in chapter 13. So this is giving us some history of the region. And then while he's living there, they rebelled, and it looks like that group, the Chedorlaomer's group, came through and just started attacking locations. And what I can tell on this is these regions, the Asherah, Karnaim, Ham, and Shaval, Kiriathim, I should have had Stephen reread those again. Those locations are up north part of Israel, Sea of Galilee, just a little bit, and kind of off to the right there. So they would have been probably the first area that they're coming in if they're curving over that Syrian desert. Then verse 6 through 7, we get introduced to the Horites, which is in their Mount Seir. So that's actually the location right south of the Dead Sea. There's a little inlet of water, if you look at your maps, that comes up from the Red Sea, and it's that mountain is basically between those two locations. So now we're at the bottom of Israel, kind of over there. I think it's where the Midianites would have been established, kind of more of a natural barrier between Israel and the Midianites. And then we get into Kadesh, where they smote all the country of the Amalekites, the Amorites, and they dwelt in Hazon Hatamir. The interesting piece is there actually are no Amalekites at the time of this writing. They're actually a descendant of Esau. And so that's the area that they would have settled from Esau, not necessarily, they're not there at this time. We've kind of seen a couple of times where Moses uses this in writing this book to inform the people who are reading it, the people who are listening to it. They have a geographical location because of the current history or current time that they're living, not necessarily what was going on at that time. Kind of do the same thing today. If we want to know where a city may have changed names or something, we may reference it that even though at some previous point in time it was labeled something else. So that puts us through verse 7. Once again, Kadesh is in the northern part of Israel. Mount Seir is in the Dead Sea. So whereas before we've kind of had these isolated geographical locations, now we're kind of looking at the Mount Seir here and the north part of Israel up here. Verses 9 through 10, we get into the actual battle from the rebellion, where we call them the Babylonian kings. No, it's not necessarily the correct term, just as a geographical reference. They're attacking the kings over in what's modern day Israel. And they wind up in the slime pits. And he's got a note here that he's not 100% sure if when it says Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, if they went into it and fell into the slime pits for protection, hoping that the invading armies wouldn't follow them into it, or if they were actually killed in this location. He's not, I guess, willing to take one side or the other on that. Regardless, they were defeated. It sounds like a pretty unpleasant area. The slime pits, if you look at some of how Strong's defined it, also talks about potential asphalt or tar pits. And if you've ever seen the hot asphalt when they're paving roads and stuff, it's not some stuff you really want to be close to. So it's probably from reading at a location where they thought maybe they could get away from them, or they got their backs up to it and got defeated, one of the two. And then verse 11, where we kind of ended up, so basically they've eliminated the army to the point they're no longer a threat. And so they go raid Sodom and Gomorrah. So it sounds like they left the cities completely indefensible, or they didn't leave a defense at the city. So they just went in, got what they wanted, and took off. As we find out here, and if I can get someone to start reading in verses 12 through 14, and the names are a lot easier this time around.
And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner. And these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan.
Thank you. So I find it interesting. This is actually the first time we actually see the word Hebrew in the Bible. Moffat's got it defined as a man from across the river. I think that the Strong's defines it as meaning one from beyond. So it was recognized that he was not somebody that belonged in the area that he was currently living. So it looks like he found some allies at this point, some individuals. Not sure the background on them, how, but he's actually dwelling on someone else's land at this point, even though he's been promised all of it. It says he's dwelling on the land of Mamre, but he's still not recognized as an Amorite like Mamre is. So he's still someone who's living on that land, but he's not someone who is, I guess, technically a part of that land at this time. Take it also at this point that he's someone who's fairly well known, and probably well known that Lot is associated with him, because as an invading army comes, somebody recognized what was happening, knew Lot well enough, and knew where to find Abram, and knew there was a connection there. And either I'm guessing if you're somebody, you're looking for somewhere that you can be safe, or trying to get word to these individuals that something's going on, your brother's in trouble, you need to help him. I also find it interesting that at the beginning they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, and then if you look down in verse 14, Abram heard that his brother was taken captive. It's kind of an interesting that up until this point we always refer to him as his brother's son, and then all of a sudden Abram recognizes his brother's missing. I don't know if that is significant other than maybe the English translation, but it's either, and this is me speaking, so I'm definitely up for anybody arguing with me, and it's just kind of a thought, not necessarily biblical truth here, but either Abram at this point is recognizing that the separation and that Lot is no longer underneath his patriarchal rule, and he's his own separate patriarch, so now they're more of a brother relationship rather than a subordinate relationship, or it could be that this is the only other person that is of his tribe, of his people, that's in the area, and it's simply a familial relationship that anybody that's from that tribe recognizes as a brother that's in trouble. But I just thought it was interesting that you kind of see that relationship, or that Abram recognizes a little bit of a different relationship there. The other piece that's interesting in this section is in 14. Abram has trained military soldiers with him. It makes a point that these men are trained for warfare, basically. We don't see what we see with Israel, where you've got this country that comes together, you've got hundreds of thousands or thousands upon thousands of troops. You've got these little groups that come together, they form one larger group and they go attack. That's what's happened with the Babylonian group that's come in. That's how the Sodom and Gomorrah and those groups have come to fight. But Abram is large enough on his own. He's got 318 trained individuals, and he's got the weapons to support them. To have a group like this, it really shows probably the level of his wealth, because you've got a group of trained men. They're probably not taking care of flocks or any kind of crops or anything like that. It's going to be more or less a financial drain on somebody like this in order to keep those men fed, those men trained, and those men with the right weapons. So it's kind of it shows the wealth, the level of wealth that he has at this point to have that size military under his control when he's not even a city, not anything like that. These men are servants; they were born to him, so it's at least a generational thing. And so he's got this group. He arms them, and they go. And we also find out later that Abram would have been the 319th individual, and then Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, the Amorites that he's living with, that he's allied, actually traveled with him. We'll find that a little bit later. So you've got an army of just, from what we can read here, assuming they don't bring anybody with them because we're not told they are, about 320 people heading out to do what 5 kings in their military couldn't.
You're right, so we're not told, I don't know if this one, I'll read it. He had 318 people who were able to fight. So you think about, they're either, fathers or sons, they're in a family unit. So if there's 3 or 4 people on the average in each one of those, I mean, Abraham had a family unit of over 1,000 people easily. Almost like a small town if you were traveling around. And like you get ready to point out, he was confederate to those, where he was living, those gods were friendly to him. They might have saw benefits, they probably saw that God was with Abraham, so it was in their interest to be friendly to him. They were probably blessed along with Abraham in that area. It's always, we've seen that pattern before in the Bible.
Him and Lot's blessings were because of his relationship with Abraham. So.
Right. And those guys, when Abraham took his 318, later on, you're going to see where, we're going to read here, where the king of Sodom had to pay him back. He said, I don't want anything from you. But he calls out those 3 men. He goes, but for them, go ahead and give them what they deserve. Again, we're not told, but I assume that those guys didn't show it by themselves. I would assume those guys have probably been like Abraham and had big groups with them.
Right.
I'm sure they probably brought their armies with them. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know how many would have been. But I bet you there was a larger number that went to the 318 were told that Abraham as well.
Because there's more Amorites. We read where Chedorlaomer has already gone to war and attacked Amorites. There's other Amorites in the area, so you have to assume that there's other individuals with him. I agree. David, anything else, Tom? If I get somebody to read verses 15 and 16.
And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and he smote them and pursued them unto Copeland, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and he brought back again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the woman also, and the people.
So, I'm going to put this here. This to me is the evidence that God authored and told them what to write, and it's not man sitting here writing it down. Because if we're watching a movie, this part right here would be probably the high point of the movie. This would have been the bulk of the amount of book that a man would have written. He goes up, he saves the day, he comes back. That's all we get out of the deal. To me, it's very, very interesting. That's all we're going to get at this point, especially when you get into the Judges, we get some details about how God produced the victory, and we get into Joshua, we get some details about how God produced the victory here. He was victorious. He came home. Based off of starting in Hebron and going up into the area of Damascus, and then adding the 80 miles from Hoeb Fountain, which is from Jerry Moffat. He said it's about 80 miles from that Hoeb into the northwest of Damascus. He traveled about 280 to 300 miles to execute this. It wasn't just a hop, skip, and a jump. I mean, it was a pursuit in order to do this. I tried to look it up to see what the warfare at the time was. I think basically your large superpowers like Egypt had the chariots. So I'm guessing these individuals went on foot to the best of what I can come up with. So you're looking at a couple, days of pursuit, not just to go over there for the afternoon and come back. There was some dedicated time here to go up there and get it done. We see that strategy, and Moffat brings it up. We see the night attacks happening on occasion in the Bible. Gideon did it, and destruction was really from confusion rather than from actual sword-to-sword warfare between Gideon's men. And I brought Gideon up. I can't remember who he was fighting at the time. Apologize. Saul did it on the third watch, which is between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. in 1 Samuel chapter 11. We also see that the division of forces was used in both of those examples also. Gideon spread his men out through the town. Joshua used it fighting Ai, they split, and even other countries used it. We see where the Philistines in 1 Samuel 13 actually split their men out. The other piece that's interesting is fighting at night I don't think it was real common. I've heard that stated before. They didn't have the technology that we have today. If you're lighting your way with torches, the enemy's going to see you as well as you're going to see them if they don't see you before you see them, because you've got here I am scenario, whereas they're sitting there hiding in the dark till it's convenient for them the light gets close enough to actually do something. And then your attack is now on the defensive and they get the benefit out of it. The other evidence of that is in Joshua 10, God holds the day longer so that way Joshua can finish the fight against the Amorites. So that fighting, attacking at night is really an unusual strategy from what we typically see of battles at this time. And then, as we said earlier, he goes up, he conquers, and he comes back. And we're going to find out, if somebody would read verse 17, exactly what kind of fight it was.
And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him, at the valley of Shabah, which is the king's dale.
So, I think my indication on the previous verse that carries over, it was a slaughter. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't what we probably saw between Chedorlaomer and Sodom, where they met in the middle and went at it till one side realized they were losing. He just went in and slaughtered. That's a pretty extensive term to use. It indicates that it wasn't a fight. I mean, they went in, took care of business, and came home. Shaveh, being the King's Valley, they believe it's also the Kidron Valley, which is just north of, which at this time is Salem, but it was going to be Jerusalem. That's where they met. It's interesting to me that King of Sodom is coming out to meet him at this time. Sodom didn't go back, gather his forces. Either this is the same king or a new king that was at the slime pits earlier discussed. He didn't try to re-rally any more kings. He didn't do anything along those lines. He just let them take everything. He didn't follow. He didn't pursue. But as soon as Abram comes back, here he comes. And so, his people are being carried off. Abram goes after one person. He could have gone up, got Lot, came back, and been done. But he brings everything back to Sodom that it belonged. King didn't do that. He's supposed to be in control of these individuals. He's supposed to be taken care of. And a complete stranger basically came in and rescued him. So it's interesting the compassion that we actually see at Abram at this point. If somebody please read verse 18.
Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God.
This part scares me. Melchizedek keeps coming back in future verse chapters, including Psalms and actually Hebrews. I'm not going to get into all of that. I know Jesus is compared back in Hebrews about the high priest as the order of Melchizedek. Pretty sure that we probably could have a lesson series on that one at some point. But so we're just going to keep information here that we have in Genesis. So this is also something interesting I find between the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. We still don't know what the king of Sodom's name is. We get introduced to the king of Salem. Apparently he's important enough at this point to be mentioned. It also is interesting to me that in all of the attacks, everything that happens, Chedorlaomer never attacks Salem. It never talks about the attack on Melchizedek. He's obviously had to cross paths of it because of some of the attacks and where the cities he goes to, but he's never come against Salem. So either Melchizedek just recognized the rule or wasn't under their rule, but for whatever reason he was not involved in the fight. He brings bread and wine, so he's got a returning army. He brings them food and drink. If you're marching 300 miles, that's what you need. You need to make sure that you got enough food and drink. So Salem king of Salem brings this to him. The king of Sodom doesn't bring anything from what we read. So it's interesting, the thought process here. So from what we can tell here is there are other individuals while Abram is in this area that follow God. It seems that either they both realize that they both follow God, or they find out at this point. But it's interesting that that's, that Melchizedek, we read, is a king and a high priest. I'm getting ahead of myself in my notes, trying to cover more than we've already read. Somebody go ahead and read verses 19 and 20, please.
And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything.
All right. So this is the part that's, whereas King of Sodom probably came out and saw Abram's victory, Melchizedek comes out and sees God's victory. It's interesting also at this point that we see Abram paying tithes to Melchizedek. You actually can get into some other verses, and I apologize, or in Hebrews chapter 7, I did write it down. So Abram is seen, especially back when you get to Hebrews and you're discussing this with the Jews, he is the patriarch. He is seen as as the forefather of the Jewish nation, of the Israel nation. Even as being the patriarch of somebody like this, who's the blessings that Jesus' seed came from, he recognizes there is somebody in that area that is higher than him. So Melchizedek is the king, he's recognized as the priest, and then even after everything Abram's done, he pays respect to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek pays respect to God. So they don't forget where the victory comes from. We also recognize at this point that Abram's not necessarily the most powerful person in this region, and he's not the only one that is actually following God. And if we go ahead and finish up with verses 21 through 24.
The king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I may not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion.
So we start off with the king of Sodom once again. This guy just interests me. So he comes to Abram. He doesn't bring anything. He doesn't recognize what has happened. And his first word that we get recognized that is written down is give. It's an order. It's a command. He's telling him to do something. The king of Sodom didn't go get the people. He didn't go get the goods. He says give. And he's asking for the people, which I guess shows some restraint that he's telling him to keep everything else. So Abram, as we start continuing verse 22, tells the king of Sodom, he reiterates the same thing that Melchizedek and Abram just went through. The victory isn't mine, the victory is God's. I didn't do this, God did. He refuses at this point to allow his status, which is obviously, as we've discussed, when he's moved, when he's talking about the fighting men, the amount of animals and herdsmen and servants that him and Lot had, that he is already an incredibly wealthy individual. The goods may not have meant that much more to Abram. It may have been significant, but regardless of the amount, he would not let it taint anything he had already earned that God had already given him, because then nobody's going to be able to come behind him and say, oh yeah, he was wealthy before, but Sodom gave him all that. No, he had the wealth beforehand. This is back where Chris was mentioning that he did say that whatever we've eaten, just let us, to keep the soldiers going, let that be my reward. And then the individuals, the Amorites that went with him, Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol, let them take their portion, so let them get rewarded for it. Now, whether they've had individuals with them, you have to assume they had to bring somebody with them. So at least those individuals did get something out of aiding the process. The other piece I thought was interesting is he didn't want the king of Sodom's wealth to taint what he had gained, but we never read where he gave the stuff back to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh paid for the wife, or for Sarah to be his wife, and then got rid of him, as quick as he could once he found out what happened, and we never read anything given back to him. So he's potentially, I guess, hopefully gotten a little bit wiser at this point about the goods and trusting in God, and even though we see when he comes up to the king and Sarah becomes somebody else's wife again. But he's got a little bit better perspective on the wealth that he has at this point, where he didn't when he was in Egypt. Another piece I thought was interesting here is we've read that he paid a tithe, which is what we usually recognize as a tenth, to Melchizedek before Sodom got their goods back. So God got his portion through the gift of Melchizedek before man got returned back to the king. So that's what I have for chapter 15, and I may be a little late, but so anybody have any last comments, questions? If you do, write them down, give them to Chris, so he can answer next week. All right, Stephen, if you would, please lead us in prayer and get into our worship hour also.